Welcome to Neural Nexus Podcast, where we explore the hottest topics shaping the world. Let's dive in.
Okay, let's unpack this. The sources you've shared, they paint a vivid and, frankly, pretty intense picture of what's been unfolding in some major U.S. cities lately.
Yeah, that's right. We're seeing these escalating tensions around immigration enforcement, specifically ICE operations, and, well, a pretty significant public backlash playing out.
Right, playing out right on the streets.
Yeah.
The reports you provided really focus on protests that have flare up in both New York City and Los Angeles.
Exactly. The source material we're drawing from here includes transcripts, news reports, things like that. They give us accounts from the ground in NYC and LA.
So we get a sense of what happened, how authorities responded.
And the community feelings behind it all, at least as reported in these specific sources.
Absolutely. Our mission for this deep dive is really to get into the specifics from these reports. We want to look at what happened in both cities.
Pinpoint those key incidents that the sources seem to suggest might be driving the unrest.
Yeah, and explore the different perspectives, from officials, people in the community, observers, all based on what's in these sources.
And try to understand the dynamics, the complex interplay between federal enforcement, local authorities, and the communities.
Think of it as getting a clearer picture, just based on these accounts you've shared, of a situation that seems to be changing fast.
It really does. It feels like the friction points are just multiplying. And understanding these specific reported events is key to getting a handle on the bigger picture the sources present.
Okay, let's start on the East Coast then. New York City. The sources talk about protests in Lower Manhattan.
That's right. Federal Plaza, which, is where ICE has its headquarters there.
And these weren't just peaceful demonstrations. The reports say they escalated.
Yeah, they describe them starting as demonstrations, but then becoming violent. Getting out of hand is a phrase used. Clashes between protesters and police and immigration officers, too.
And people were detained.
Several people, yes. The NYPD confirmed they took people into custody. One source mentioned a number, around 20 arrests or detentions right there during the protests.
Now, what's really interesting is digging into why this might be happening now. The sources point to some specific incidents, don't they?
They do. One report really highlighted the detention of at least 2 NYC high school students by ICE.
High school students.
Yeah, and the detail that stands out in the report is that they were apparently detained when they showed up for their asylum hearings, seemingly doing what they were supposed to do.
Ah, okay. So the report suggests this challenges the idea that enforcement is only focused on, say, violent criminals. That seems to be a key trigger point mentioned.
Exactly. That detail about students trying to follow the procedures, that really seemed to resonate in the reporting. And there was another incident mentioned.
Go on.
From Friday, reportedly. ICE arrested a migrant inside a federal courthouse. And this was after his immigration case had actually been dismissed.
Inside the courthouse, after the case was dismissed.
That's what the source reported. Now, DHS, according to that same source, claimed he resisted arrest, even punched an officer during what they called an aggressive takedown.
Okay, so you have these specific, quite dramatic incidents reported.
Right. And they feed into this broader concern mentioned in the sources, this perception that ICE officers might be detaining migrants as they're trying to engage with the system, going to court, following the rules to be here lawfully, as one source put it.
The feeling being, as presented in the sources, that people are trying to do the right thing and getting penalized for it anyway.
That seems to be the sentiment captured in some of the reporting, yes.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit. The context in New York City, as the sources present it, it's a sanctuary city, right?
It is. And the reports mention the mayor, other officials have stated they won't assist ICE with arrests. That's the city policy mentioned.
But the NYPD, the city police, they still have a role.
A different role, as described in the sources. They're seen as duty-bound to maintain public safety during protests, making sure things don't get out of control, people don't get hurt.
And there are way more NYPD officers than federal agents on the scene, one source points out.
Right. And interestingly, one report mentioned that DHS actually praised the NYPD for their quick response in calming things down in New York, contrasting it, apparently, with LA.
And NYC's identity as a city of immigrants, that's mentioned too, over 140 languages spoken.
Yeah, that historical context is brought up, and it feeds into what the sources describe as a really complex tension within communities there, and how that tension might be shifting.
Shifting how? What kind of tension are the sources describing?
Well, it seems to be coming from different places. On one hand, the sources talk about this feeling some people had that the city government was bending over backwards for migrants,
How so?
mentioning things like benefit packages, phones, debit cards, hotel stays. And the reports say this burned a lot of New Yorkers who were struggling themselves, maybe with getting food assistance, things like that.
So resentment building there, linked to that feeling reported in the sources about the city being overrun after an open-door policy.
That seems to be part of the picture painted by the reports. But then, the sources say, a different line was drawn by many people when they saw ICE detaining people who seemed to be following the rules, like those high school students, or others playing by the rules they were given, trying to do the right thing, as the reports put it. Seeing them penalized, that apparently caused consternation.
Ah, okay. So it's a shift in who people perceive as being targeted.
Exactly. One source contrasts this with previous sentiment. It says people were all for ICE getting rid of criminals, gangs.
It mentioned something specific, trend at AUA.
Yeah, that phrase, trend at AUA, was specifically mentioned as a concern in one source, though the source didn't really detail what that trend was. But the point was, getting rid of that and the entrenched crime wave some allegedly brought, that really offended people, and there was support for targeting that.
But the concern now, according to these reports, is that the targets have broadened.
That's the perception driving the concern, reported in the sources. A distinction being drawn between targeting known criminals, which was supported, versus targeting people just trying to navigate the legal process, which is causing this backlash.
Got it. And what about the official federal stance on these protests? What do the sources say about that?
While one source mentions the DHS secretary issuing a strong warning, basically saying rioters won't stop ICE operations.
So, business as usual for IC.
That's the message. IC will keep enforcing federal law, and assaults on officers will be prosecuted. The takeaway from the sources is ICE is not backing down.
And more protests are expected.
Based on social media activity mentioned in the reports, yes. Activists calling for action, streets might be blocked. It sounds like the situation in New York, as reported, is definitely ongoing.
Okay, a really complex picture there. Let's move across the country now. Los Angeles. The sources describe escalating tensions there, too.
They do. Downtown LA marking the third day in a row of protests against ICE operations when these reports came out.
And where exactly in LA? Same kind of locations?
Pretty much. Near the federal complex, the Metropolitan Detention Center, the federal courthouse on Alamo Street, those areas.
And the scale of the response there. The sources made that sound significant.
Yeah, visually striking is how it comes across in the reports. Federal law enforcement agents, but also the California National Guard, lined up against protesters.
National Guard. That feels like a big step.
Huge. The reports call it an unprecedented move by President Trump, federalizing the Guard, deploying 2,000 troops to LA County.
And crucially,
The sources explicitly state this was done over the objection of Governor Gavin Newsom.
wow. Okay, what about the protesters themselves? What did the reports say about the crowd in LA?
A couple hundred people, according to one source. And many seemed prepared. Masks, goggles, even gas masks were mentioned. Yeah, signs like abolish ICE. ICE out of LA. Flags from different countries. Mexico, Guatemala mentioned. An interesting detail from one source was the mix of anger, but also some friendliness. Someone offered the reporter water when they were coughing from tear gas.
Tear gas. So things got confrontational.
Definitely. Federal law enforcement used tear gas pellets, flashbangs, too, according to one report, trying to disperse the crowd about half an hour before the report was filed.
Did it work?
The source says it didn't work. The crowd came back, was waiting. You could hear coughing from the lingering gas, apparently. Helicopters overhead, too.
And the LAPD. What was their role, according to the sources? Similar to NYPD.
Similar, but maybe with a stronger emphasis in the reporting on clarifying their lack of involvement in the raids. LAPD tried to make it very clear, one source said, that they weren't involved in picking people up for IC.
But they were involved in
Keeping the peace was the phrase used, especially when protesters were obstructing federal law enforcement.
and arrests happened there, too.
Yes, LAPD confirmed 11 arrests during protests the night before one of the reports came out.
Okay, so confrontations, arrests, National Guard. What about the political reactions reported in the sources? Must have been strong.
Very divided. President Trump was asked about invoking the Insurrection Act. He reportedly said it depends on whether or not there is an insurrection, adding California wasn't one, but involved violent people. They wouldn't let get away with it.
And Republicans supporting this.
House Speaker Mike Johnson was reported defending the president, saying he is doing exactly what he needs to do.
But Democrats, like the governor,
Strong criticism. Governor Newsom, other Democrats, like Leader Jeff mentioned in one source, called the decision to federalize the Guard excessive, an overreach and an overstep.
Their argument being,
That the federal government was essentially taking over for a spectacle, not because local law enforcement couldn't handle it.
which brings us to that expert analysis you mentioned was in one of the sources. John Cohen, former DHS official.
Right. Former acting undersecretary for intelligence at DHS, and he apparently used to be a police officer in LA County, so he knows the area.
What was his take, as reported?
Well, his perspective, according to the source, was that LA County law enforcement is skilled. They've handled situations like this before, contained demonstrations, made arrests when needed, minimized violence.
So his concern was,
His concern, as reported, was that bringing in the National Guard, combined with the administration's rhetoric, was actually exacerbating the situation, potentially throttling it towards more confrontation, was the phrasing used.
did he comment on the targets of enforcement like we discussed in the NYC context?
He did. He recalled the administration's stated focus was on violent criminals, gang members.
Oh,
But according to Cohen in the source, the community objection comes because operations seem to have expanded to include grandmothers, mothers, high school kids, young babies who are getting cancer treatment, and that Americans are expressing concern about that.
that's a striking list. Did he have any observations about the scene itself?
Yeah, one observation reported was quite telling from his perspective. He noted seeing the line of federal law enforcement backed by the Guard,
But
but he was not seeing the state and locals, the LAPD or sheriff's deputies, who he said would normally be responsible for clearing streets on that front line. He found that premature from a law enforcement standpoint.
implying local forces could have handled it.
That seems to be the implication reported from his analysis, that the federal intervention wasn't necessarily needed at that stage for crowd control and might even be counterproductive, highlighting that perceived disconnect between federal response and local capabilities again.
Yeah, that disconnect really seems central here. Okay, so let's try and connect the dots between these two cities based purely on what these sources are telling us.
Well, the core issue seems clear. In both NYC and LA, we're seeing significant public protests sparked by increased ICE enforcement operations, as reported.
And common triggers seem to be emerging from the reports. It's not just general disagreement with policy, is it?
No, it seems these specific incidents really ignited things or made them worse. The detention of people who aren't perceived as dangerous criminals, those students in NYC, people reportedly plucked out of daily life in LA, that courthouse arrest in New York.
That perception, highlighted in the reports, that enforcement is going beyond violent offenders, seems key in both places.
Absolutely. And then there's that friction between federal actions and local stances or capabilities.
Right. You see it in NYC with the sanctuary city status versus federal action,
Yeah.
even if the city says it won't help.
And much more dramatically in LA, with the governor explicitly objecting to the National Guard deployment, only to be overridden. Plus, that expert's point about local police capabilities versus the federal takeover.
Yeah. And finally, the sources show this dynamic of escalation in both situations.
Things starting perhaps smaller or less intense, but then escalating. Clashes, arrests, and in LA, that very visible, militarized federal presence and things like tear gas being used.
It really paints a picture drawn from these sources of federal actions hitting local contexts and igniting these reactions based on specific community concerns and maybe historical trust issues.
Exactly. It's complex, and these reports give us a window into how it's playing out on the ground.
So this deep dive, just looking at the source material you shared, has hopefully laid out the specifics. The incidents fueling the protests in NYC and LA, the different government responses, the feelings within the communities as reported.
Yeah, hopefully pulling these details together from the reports gives you, the listener, a clearer, maybe less overwhelming sense of the different dynamics and perspectives involved here. It's clearly a situation that's still unfolding.
Absolutely. And reflecting on these sources, thinking about the community objections described when enforcement seems to broaden beyond violent criminals, and that whole debate reported in LA about whether the big federal response was needed versus local capabilities, maybe it leaves us with this thought.
What is the intended scope of immigration enforcement actions? And ultimately, who should be responsible for managing that tricky intersection where federal law meets local public order?
Something to definitely think about.